It's really quite something, isn't it? This
Yeah.
idea that chatting with departed spirits, so central to, Western spiritualism back then.
Yeah, it was huge in the West.
Exactly. But then you look east, and specifically for Hindus and certain Buddhists, it was like completely taboo, even abhorrent.
Deeply problematic, yes, a fundamental disconnect. And that's really what we're diving into today.
We're looking at this fascinating Tibetan Buddhist perspective, a direct rebuttal, actually, from the late 19th century.
It comes from H.P. Blavatsky's Tibetan Teachings, published in 1894. But the core of it, the really interesting part, is presented as the views of a very learned Tibetan Lama.
The Chohan Lama of Rinpoche, major figure. And he's responding directly to how the West was understanding, or maybe misunderstanding, Buddhism at the time.
Specifically hitting back at Arthur Lilly's book, Buddha and Early Buddhism.
Right. So this isn't just some academic debate. It's presented as a correction from inside the tradition.
Which is pretty rare, getting that direct viewpoint.
Okay, so our mission, let's say, for this deep dive, we want to really unpack what these Tibetan teachings say about spiritual beings. What happens after death, if communication is even a thing.
And crucially, this difference they make between the public teachings, the exoteric stuff, and the hidden esoteric meaning.
Yeah, that seems key. The goal here is to get you a clearer picture, maybe bust some long-standing myths about Tibetan Buddhism on these points. It gets pretty wild.
Definitely goes beyond the surface level stuff you usually hear.
So what actually kicked this whole exchange off? Why did this Lama feel the need to respond?
Well, the backstory is Blavatsky herself.
Yeah.
She apparently sent a review of Lilly's book, and get this, the review was written by a spiritualist.
Oh, interesting. So someone already inclined to see spirits everywhere.
Exactly. She sent this spiritualist take to two big figures. The Buddhist high priest of Ceylon, representing Southern Buddhism,
Okay.
and the Chohan Lama in Tibet, this high-ranking figure in Northern or Tibetan Buddhism. She wanted their take, their corrections.
And this deep dive, we're focusing on the Tibetan response, the Chohan Lama's promised reply.
That's the core of these texts we're looking at, yeah. It seems there was a delay, but eventually parts of this response were published. It's presented as his perspective, clarifying things from the Tibetan side.
All right. So let's get to the main clash. The spiritualist reviewer basically said, Buddhism is full of modern spiritualism's main idea, departed spirits hanging around guiding us.
Yeah, permeated was the word used, like it was foundational.
And the Tibetan response, how do they counter that directly?
It was stark. The Lama's view, as reported, is that any intervention of departed human spirits is seen as impure, something generally loathed.
Loathed. Wow. Not just disagreed with, but actively disliked.
The text even uses the phrase anathema maranatha, which is, incredibly strong language, basically a curse on the idea.
It's just fascinating how something seen as comforting in one place could be viewed so negatively elsewhere. Did they mention any exceptions? I think the outline mentioned Hinduism.
Briefly, yeah. It acknowledges that within Hinduism, there might be beliefs about spirits returning under nasty circumstances like suicide or a violent accident creating malevolent entities.
Okay, so very specific negative cases.
Right. But the general vibe across both traditions, according to this text, is a real aversion to just casually interacting with average Joes who've passed on.
And the text zeroes in on Northern Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah.
Does it say much about the Southern perspective they also asked for?
Not really in these excerpts. It mentions the intent to include the Southern views later, which suggests they knew there might be differences within Buddhism itself.
Maybe something for another time, then.
Could be. But for now, the focus is squarely on the Tibetan esoteric view.
Okay, let's tackle Lilly's theory then. He thought Buddhists were trying to use good spirits, like dead prophets or Buddhas, to fight off evil spirits. What did the Tibetans say to that?
They basically said, you're misunderstanding who we're talking about. Yes, highly realized beings, Buddhas, can commune with Earth from the fields of the Buddhas. But this idea that any ordinary person dies and becomes a helpful good spirit is just wrong from their perspective. There's a huge difference between a Buddha or a Bodhisattva and, Uncle Bob.
Right. Which brings us to the scriptures themselves.
Yeah.
The text insists they have hidden meanings, that you can't just read them literally.
Absolutely critical point. The Chohan Lama, or the voice in the text, stresses this duality. Even the big public collections, the Bukhagir and Bristanir, massive texts.
Thousands of volumes, right.
Huge. They have an outer meaning for the uninitiated, and then this inner esoteric meaning only for those who have the key. Without the key, you miss the point.
And this is why Western scholars were supposedly getting it wrong, taking symbolism literally.
That's the argument presented, yes. They give the example of Della Penna, that Capuchin monk,
Ah, yes. He read descriptions of celestial realms and beings called La.
and took it completely literally, talking about gods and amazing cities in the sky made of jewels, all that.
Fantastical stuff.
But the Tibetan response is like, no, you're missing the symbolism. It's not meant as geography.
So if La aren't gods or generic good spirits, who or what are they, according to this teaching? And what about Changchub?
This is where it gets really specific to their path. La and Changchub aren't seen as disembodied spirits in the way a spiritualist might think. They're titles for highly advanced living practitioners.
Living, or, well, spiritually active.
Initiated arhats, bodhisattvas, people who've reached a very high stage of spiritual development. And here's the kicker. Out of compassion, they might choose to remain connected to the world to help others.
So they haven't just floated off. They stick around.
Some do, yes. The text says they might even renounce nirvana, ultimate liberation, specifically to benefit disciples or humanity. These aren't just random spirits. They're highly evolved beings making a conscious choice.
That is profoundly different from just anyone being reachable after death.
Completely different. Which then raises the question, okay, if that's not who Western spiritualists were contacting, who were they talking to, according to the Tibetans?
Right. What's the Tibetan explanation for mediums and seances?
It's pretty blunt, actually. They suggest it's the physical dregs, the sort of leftover psychic residue, or spiritless remains of the dead.
Like an echo.
Maybe. Or worse, they mention these impure souls, the atsaras, people who died violently, suicides, accidents,
Yeah.
being stuck in a kind of limbo, a false bardo.
Bardo being the intermediate state.
Right, between death and rebirth. But these souls are trapped, earthbound, because their life cycle was unnaturally cut short.
And trying to talk to them is?
Necromancy. Plain and simple, according to this text, any deliberate interaction with these earthbound souls is condemned. It's seen as harmful, causing them suffering, because they're not supposed to be interfered with in that state.
A totally different ethical view than trying to comfort or get guidance from a departed loved one.
Worlds apart. But they do allow for some very limited exceptions where a connection might remain, don't they?
Yes. Okay. What are those narrow cases?
Well, the main one is those bodhisattvas and rahats we mentioned, highly evolved beings with a pure motive to help. That's seen differently.
Makes sense, given their status.
Then, potentially, someone who had an incredibly intense focus at the moment of death, or someone with an exceptionally strong, pure, holy love for those left behind. The example given is a mother for her child.
Oh, okay. But these aren't permanent open channels.
No, the text implies these connections have varying, often limited durations and depend on specific conditions. It's not the free-for-all communication some spiritualists imagined.
It really reframes the whole idea. And it connects to their view on immortality, too, doesn't it? It's not guaranteed for everyone.
That's another key takeaway here. Immortality, in this view, isn't automatic, it's conditional. It depends on spiritual progress, on developing this thing called Laya Vijnana, described as the acme of wisdom, the deepest consciousness. It's tied into this vast cyclical view of existence, humanity being in the fourth of 7 big rounds. We're still developing, basically.
So achieving true immortality is part of the spiritual journey, not just a default state after death.
Precisely. It has to be earned, developed.
Okay, let's circle back to some specific terms. Kuan Yin, often seen as a deity, a goddess of compassion. How does this text interpret Kuan Yin?
It offers a much more esoteric interpretation, not an external deity, but the voice of the ever-present, latent divine consciousness in man.
So an internal principle,
Yeah.
like your higher self speaking.
Kind of, yeah. The voice of the true self. They even connect it to the Hindu concept of Vash, sacred speech, and the Neoplatonic logos. It's something accessed, especially in initiation.
Fascinating. Less a being to pray to, more a potential within you to awaken.
That seems to be the gist of the esoteric view presented here.
And this brings us towards the end point, this prophecy about the Bonchen Rinpoche and Tibetan. What exclusivity? Why were they supposedly keeping this stuff under wraps?
The text explains this through a prophecy. The idea was that the true doctrine, in its purity, needed to be safeguarded in Tibet.
Safe from what?
From being misunderstood or corrupted by, as the text puts it, the West's crude ideas of fundamental truth. Essentially, the West wasn't philosophically ready yet.
A bit condescending, maybe, but okay.
Well, it reflects their perspective at the time. The prophecy predicted that only when the world was ready, a future great incarnation, the great jewel of wisdom, would appear and illuminate everything properly.
And that explains why Tibet was historically so isolated, trying to protect these teachings.
That's presented as a major reason, yes. Protecting the esoteric core until the conditions were right.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up,
Right.
the big picture is this massive gulf between the Tibetan Buddhist view and the Western spiritualist one back in.
Huge gulf. Different ideas about spirits, death, communication, everything really hinges on this esoteric understanding they talk about.
Yeah, the symbolic nature of texts, the special role of these bodhisattvas, and this strong rejection of just casually contacting any old spirit.
It paints a picture where spiritual interaction is possible, but highly specific, conditional, and generally focused on advanced beings or requires advanced development yourself, not just picking up the phone to the other side.
It emphasizes that inner work, that spiritual evolution over external phenomena.
Definitely. And it really cautions against messing with lower level or trapped energies, framing it as harmful necromancy.
So for you listening, we hope this has maybe cleared up some confusion or at least shown you a very different, very specific perspective on these things, going beyond some of the maybe simpler ideas out there.
Yeah, it's definitely complex, which I suppose leads to a final thought for you to chew on.
Go for it.
How does this whole idea of hidden esoteric knowledge sit with you? You know, this concept of a tradition deliberately keeping its deeper truths veiled. What are the pros and cons of that?
And what about that idea of conditional immortality, the idea that it's tied to your spiritual growth, developing that alaya vijnana? How does that land compared to other ideas about the afterlife?
Lots to think about there. This tradition clearly puts a huge emphasis on the path on development.
Absolutely. We've really only scratched the surface here, of course. It's an incredibly deep and complex tradition.
Oh, sure.
So if your curiosity is piqued, definitely keep exploring. Look into different sources, different perspectives on these really profound questions about life, death, and consciousness.